So far, so good. Little by little. So good. Apart from the echo, but that's one of those things you just have to deal with. All right. Wow, that actually was up and running before 12 o'clock. That's pretty impressive. I'll give it a second to let people log in, because I'm sure they were startled by how quickly it came up. Every now and then the system works the way it's supposed to. And then we will get down to our study for today. As those of you who are already logged in will know, or who are watching this on YouTube, we are going to be studying Megillat Rut today. This is in the place of the normal Torah study. Normally we would study the Parashat HaShavua, the Torah portion of the week, but this week there isn't a Torah portion for the week. This week there is a Torah portion for Shavuot, for the festival of Shavuot. And while that is amazing and wonderful, both the portion on Exodus as well as in Deuteronomy from first day and second day, those are portions that we will study in the normal course of our Torah study. So I thought, you know what, let's do something a little different. Let's study the other major text that is read on Shavuot, and that is, of course, Megillat Rut, the book of Ruth. Yes, it is Megillah. Just as there is Megillat Esther, the book of Esther, there is also Megillat Rut, the book of Ruth, and Kohelet and Eicha, as well as Shir HaShirim. But this one is the text that is read on Shavuot. So we're going to keep using Rashi. Rashbam does not have a commentary on Megillat Rut. So we will keep using Rashi as our guide and see just how much of it we can study together. And hopefully this will give a few more insights into this amazing story. It is one of my favorite books of the entire Tanakh. So let's see what we can do. All right. So we are going to begin on chapter 1, verse 1, and we'll be going back and forth through the text as well as the commentary. And it happened in the days when the judges judged, that there was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the fields of Moab, he with his wife and 2 sons. All right, just a few Englishy type things that we need to get cleared up. When we use the term judges, the shofet or shoftim, we are talking about the period that is characterized by Samson, by Deborah, by Gideon, I'm sorry, and by a phone that I forgot to silence. It's the joy of technology. It can interrupt us anytime, any place. Okay. That's the section that we are talking about in the text right now. So the book of Ruth is historically situated in that time period. However, it is not part of the Nevi'im. It is not part of the prophets in the Tanakh, the Nun of Tanakh, because it is not considered to be one of the prophetic works, but is instead considered a scribal work. So that's why it's in Ketuvim. So we are in that time period. And then we are finding out that there is a man from the place of Bethlehem, and that he is going to Moab. Now, here we get one of my favorite English words, because I think that if we weren't reading anything biblical in English, we probably would never use this word again. Sojourn. So sojourn is the very fancy way of saying in English what it's very simple to say in Hebrew, which is you go somewhere to live temporarily. You're not moving to a place, you are not settling in a place, you are not becoming an expat from your home country, you're not an immigrant to the new country in the technical sense of the word, you are a foreign resident that is there temporarily. It's really hard to say that in English unless you use the word sojourn, but of course most people don't know the word sojourn, and that's why I had to explain. Okay, so there's a famine, and this man from Bethlehem, leaves and goes to Moab to sojourn. Now, what do we know about Moab? Well, we know Moab are distant cousins coming from the line of Lot, the nephew of Abraham. And we know that Moab and the Israelites have a rocky relationship on the whole. On the one hand, they are distant cousins. On the other hand, we are, as on the same hand, we're not allowed to conquer and take from their lands. On the other hand, they have attacked us at multiple times, and they have not always been very kind to us. And on the other hand, there is a prohibition in the Torah of allowing someone from Moab, as well as the Ammonites, from entering into the Jewish people, conversion, if you will. So that tension is going to be important throughout the rest of the story. So keep that in mind. The man's name was Elimelech, his wife's name was Naomi, and the names of his two sons were Machlon and Kilion. Ephratites from Bethlehem in Judah. They came to the Moabite country and remained there. Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her two sons. They married Moabite women, one of whom was named Orpah, and the name of the second was Rut. I'll be using Rut or Ruth. This is a translation from a different type of Ashkenazic pronunciation, and so they call her Rus throughout the text. No relationship to Russia. And they lived there for about 10 years. They both died, Machlon and Kilion. The woman was bereft of her two sons and of her husband. All right, we're going to leave there and go back up for our commentary. But notice that this temporary time in Moab turns into 10 years. And in the course of that 10 years, the main Elimelech, the main man of the house, dies, and then his two sons die as well after having married from the local women. So let's go back up to our top here and see what Rashi has to say about all of this. Let's see if I can't synchronize those texts. And from our opener, it happened in the days when judges judged, that is to say, during the period before King Shaul, before Saul reigned, when the generations were administered by judges, or chieftains might be a better way of putting it, of tribal ad hoc leadership. And this occurred in the days of Itzan. As our sages said, Itzan is Boaz. So this is a midrash brought in from our classical sources to try and give a particular timeline. And a man went. All right, so who is this man? Vayelech ish. Right, it's an unusual phrase, so it demands a bit more explanation. Well, according to the midrash, he was very wealthy and the leader of the generation. As we just said, we can attempt to identify him with Itzan. So he left Eretz Israel, he left Israel for regions out of the land because of his stinginess. For he was miserly toward the poor who came to press him. Therefore, he was punished. So the Midrash is trying to read a general lesson throughout the entire book of Ruth and using the totality of its themes to try and fill in the missing information. Now, the major missing information we have in verse 1 is, why would this man of Beit Lechem leave? I mean, he is living in Israel. It's during the time of Judges. What is prompting him to leave the country entirely? Well, say the Midrashic scholars, let's look at the totality. What are the themes of the book of Ruth? Well, one of the central themes is the theme of poverty, the theme of helping those that are poor, the theme of redeeming land from those who had to sell it due to their desperation, and that following the halakha for taking care of the poor, the allowing of the gleaning and the taking from the fields by the poor is a central feature of Boaz's righteousness, who is, of course, along with Ruth, the main hero of the story. So to contrast that, we need two different people. One of those is going to be very obvious, which is Ploni Almoni, the man at the very end of the story who refuses to redeem the land of Naomi, if that means that he is going to have to also marry Ruth. And now we also need the contrast in of Elimelech of giving us, well, why was he leaving in the first place? It was because, unlike Boaz, he was unwilling to allow people to come and to enjoy the benefit of his fields. That as there was a famine, people would come, they'd want to glean, they'd want to take from his fields, and he decided it was better to liquidate his assets, just lock up the farm, so to speak, and moved to Moab, where he was under no requirements by local Moabite law to share with the poor the same way. So therefore, in his mind, he would be able to hold on to his wealth better than if he had to share it with those that were in desperate need during the famine. So the Midrash may be adding much into the story, maybe reading between the lines in a way that some people I know are often skeptical of. And it's perfectly fine to say, I'm not 100% sure this is exactly what happened when Elimelech left, but to recognize that the Midrashic scholars were trying to answer the questions of the text from within the text and what else we know from Torah is, I think, a very powerful reminder of how they worked. And to see that the explanation they come up with fits the coherent theme and message of this book is just a testament to their brilliance and insights. Moving on to our verse 2 commentary, we get this very strange Ephratite, and Rashi records that these are important people. And similarly, the son of Tohu, the son of Tzup, an Ephratite, meaning some type of aristocrat. Look at how important they were. For Eglon, the king of Moab, married off his daughter to Machlon. As the master said, Rut was the daughter of Eglon. Another explanation of Ephratite is that they were from Beit Lechem, because Beit Lechem is called Ephros. So the idea here is that we have two explanations for what this unusual word is. One is that this is simply a designation of being aristocracy in that region. And how would we know that they were aristocrats? Well, because of another tradition that says that Ruth came from Eglon, which was one of the kings of Moab. That would imply that, well, the king wouldn't marry off his marry off his daughter to someone who was unimportant. Therefore, this term must be a statement about their aristocratic credentials. On the other hand, as Rashi often does, the other explanation is a little more mundane, that this could just be another term for people who come from Beit Lechem, trying to just let us know that this is their patronage, that this is where they came from. The same way that you might say, so-and-so is from New York, his kids are real, big applers. I don't think people actually say that, but you get the idea that they are using a substitute nickname for the region as a description of the people who come from it. And now in verse 3, we get our question of why are we referring to Naomi's husband? Because after all, we already know who this is from earlier in the text, not very long ago. Why is this stated again? From here they derived, a man does not die except for his wife, meaning, according to the editor, that she feels the loss more than anyone. Another interpretation, and it states Naomi's husband, that is to say, that because he was Naomi's husband and ruled over her, and she was subordinate to him, therefore the divine attribute of justice struck him and not her. So two explanations again. The first explanation is simply trying to say, why mention that Elimelech was the husband of Naomi? Why mention the wife at all? Why not just say Elimelech died and Naomi was left with her two sons? Why add in the relationship when it had already been established? It's to simply teach us that when a man dies, the one who mourns most keenly might be his wife. Now that can be both a loving and endearing situation, meaning that she cares for him, so deeply. It can also be a practical and economic situation, remembering in the ancient world that women didn't inherit from their husband, that instead was inherited by their children. And if there were no children, the inheritance would go to his male relatives. A woman would become exceedingly vulnerable at the loss of her husband. Also, there were many restrictions on how women had property, could use property to sustain themselves. And so the death of a husband could indeed make a wife, put her in a very difficult position and situation. So that could be either a loving testament of the bond between them, or a practical, she's the one who's actually in most jeopardy when the husband dies. Both explanations are fine. Now, the second interpretation, that Naomi was subordinate to Elimelech, may sound a little strange. Certainly, we don't think of wives as being subordinate in general to their husbands, or husbands to their wives for that matter. But we have to understand that they are trying to explain the Midrash of why did Elimelech die and Machlon and Kilion, why did they die rather than Naomi? Wasn't she also somebody that left the town of Bethlehem, left Israel, went to live in Moab, did all of these things that it seems that Elimelech is being punished for, and his two sons? Why wasn't she punished? And the explanation here is, well, she had no choice, that he decided to leave and she went with him because he was her husband, and she was willing to follow, and thus she was not fully culpable for the action, and thus not punished the same way that the husband and two sons were. Now, does Naomi herself feel punished? Absolutely, as we will see shortly. But this is trying to say that we, the reader, should not judge her too harshly. We should recognize that God also was not judging her too harshly, even though in her own mind, she felt that she had been judged. But more on that when we come to her statements. And then we get in verse 5, the passing of the two sons. And we have this, again, superfluous word, as we often need to comment on, the gam, which means also or both. And it says, what is the meaning of also, gam, meaning in verse 5, right? Why not just say the two of them died? Why do we have to say the two of them also died? You'll notice that the translation, as close as it's trying to keep to the text, completely omits the phrase and actually translates it as though the word gam wasn't even there in the sentence. So of course, Rashi has to explain. First, they were struck by financial loss, and their camels and their cattle died, and afterwards they also died. So the introduction of the word gam, according to Rashi and the Midrashim that he's citing, is telling us that they didn't only drop dead, that they went through a impoverishment and they went through death. And the gam is telling us that both of those things happened, both their impoverishment and their loss of life. Why is that an important point to draw our attention to? Well, because we need to understand that if we are in a narrative flow now, where we began with the assumption that Elimelech was a wealthy man, and that's why he left the town during the time of crisis, then when Naomi comes back with nothing except her daughter-in-law Ruth alongside of her, we have to explain, well, what happened to all that wealth in the meantime? Where did it go? How did they become poor? This gam becomes the hook upon which that explanation can hang. That indeed, Elimelech and then Machlon and Kilion somehow lost the wealth that had been theirs, that which they had been trying to hoard and hide from the poor, and they are now turning into those that are destitute upon their return. Now, I want to point out that this is the common thread throughout Rashi's interpretation of this. Could we interpret this differently? Absolutely. Could we interpret that Elimelech and his family left Beit Lechem during the time of famine because they were looking for something else? Absolutely. Abraham did that. Isaac did that. We know that Jacob and all of his sons eventually moved to Egypt with Joseph for famine type reasons. Famines, usually brought on by droughts, were a very common problem in the land of Israel because it is so dependent upon the rainfall. So bad rain and boom, instantly you've got a famine. So we could read the story very differently, that these are people who have been suffering time and time again, no matter where they go. But traditionally, it's not just about trying to unpack what might have actually happened to these individual people, which we can't know without more information in the text, but trying to pull a narrative message from the entirety of the book. And as I've already said, the narrative message from the entirety of the book is that someone like Boaz, who treats Ruth kindly and well, and someone like Ruth, who displays amazing personal characteristics, are people that are fitting to be the grandparents of King David, the proper line of the monarchy. That then needs the foil of who is the opposite. Well, like I said, Elimelech and Ploni Almoni at the very end, they become the opposites of that model. Now, again, if we had a video camera, is that exactly what we would see? I don't know. But can we understand more about how we are meant to behave by using these insights, which do fit very well, very tightly with the text, and really are not a stretch at all? I absolutely think so. Okay, so let's go ahead and return to our text in the book of Ruth before we do any more Rashi, because we have left off at verse 6. She, that is to say Naomi, then arose with her daughters-in-law in order to return from the fields of Moab, for she had heard in the fields of Moab that Adonai had cared for his people to give them food. She left the place where she had been, accompanied by her two daughters-in-law, and they took the road to return to the land of Judah. Naomi said to her two daughter-in-laws, "Go, return, each of you to her mother's home. May Adonai deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. May Adonai grant you that you may find security or rest, each in the home of her husband," meaning a new husband. She kissed them and they wept aloud. And they said to her, "We will return with you to your people." So let's go ahead and pause there. Just to do a quick unpacking. Naomi is heading home. There's nothing left for her in Moab. She's buried her sons and her husband here. And although she has daughter-in-laws, like I mentioned, the economy of the ancient world would tell those two women they also need to go find husbands. And that means that this group of three ladies is going to have to part company. They may like each other. They may even seem to love each other. Naomi is certainly saying that they have been very good to her, but they all need to find a place within this economic system. And that means going their separate ways. And that really is the most likely explanation for what they should do. It's not cold, it's not callous, it's just the brutal reality of what the agrarian social society was like at the time. Now, Rashi chimes in only on verse 7 from what we've just read. She left the place, right? V'tetzei min hamakom. She leaves the place. Why is this stated? Right? Why not just say that Naomi heads back home? Why do we have to have an explicit "she left the place"? That seems a redundant, superfluous phrase. If she's going somewhere, then she has to be leaving where she was. Obvious, right? If it's included, it must be telling us something else. It is already stated, and she returned from the fields of Moab, as we talked about. And from where could she return if not from the place where she had been? Rather, the phrase tells us that the departure of a righteous person from a place is noticeable and makes an impression. Its splendor departs, its glory departs, the praise of the city departs. And similarly, very famously, it's written, and Yaakov left Beersheba. So the idea of a righteous person, that their exit from a city is worthy of note, regardless of their destination, is being echoed here. More famously, people talk about that with Yaakov and his leaving, but here we see that Vayetze is as important as Vayetze, that when the righteous Naomi leaves, it is leaving the same impoverishment of the city as when Jacob left. Of course, parting is never quite as easy as it seems, because we turn to verse 10, and here the two daughter-in-laws respond. And they said to her, "We will return with you to your people." And Naomi said, "Turn back, my daughters. Why should you come with me? Am I likely to have more sons in my womb, that they may be your husbands? Turn back, my daughters, go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. Even if I could say I have hope, even if I were to have a husband tonight, and even if I were to bear sons, would you wait for them until they were grown to manhood? Would you shut yourselves in for them, denying yourselves to marry another? No, my daughters, my distress is great on your account, for against me is directed the hand of Adonai." They wept loudly again. Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth did cling to her. Okay, so we're going to pause at verse 14 and come back up. So they say, when she says, "Go find new husbands," they say, no, we'll go with you. We'll head back to the land of Israel along with you. And she then tries to push them away, telling them to leave. So we need to understand this this monologue of why would you come with me? Do I have more sons? Do I have a husband? And Rashi tries to unpack what the different points she's making are indicative of. So from verse 12, I am too old to have a husband. That meaning that I should marry him and bear sons, that you would marry them, for they would not be forbidden to you to marry, and you would not be forbidden to them, as far as the prohibition against marrying the wife of an older brother who died before he was born, for she, the widow, does require a levirate marriage, because Machlon and Chilion were not halakhically married to them because they were Gentiles and had not converted. And now they were coming to convert, as it is stated, we will return with you to your people. From now on, we will become one people. All right, a lot going on there that we need to unpack. Let's start with the bottom and then work our way back through the logic. So because the women say, we will come back with you to your people, the text understands this to mean that this is the formal statement of their intent to officially convert, to become Jewish people, to follow Adonai, to follow Torah. That to your people is that they are not just going with Naomi, they are going with her and joining the people of her people, meaning the Jewish people. Okay, with that in mind, that they are now hoping to convert, we can then say, well, they were not yet converted. If they were not yet converted when they were when they were wives to Machlon and Chilion, then we have to actually say, if they weren't Jewish at the time, then their marriage was not a Jewishly valid marriage. Whatever they may have been to each other, according to Jewish law is only binding upon Jewish people. We do not expect that Jewish law will be adhered to, or indeed we would not impose it upon others that are not under the umbrella of being part of the Brit of the covenant. And as such, the marriage between them has no legal status in the eyes of Judaism. Because it has no legal status in the eyes of Judaism, then we have to unpack the idea of, well, what would their status be vis-a-vis levirate marriage and with regards to marrying a brother of their deceased husband. And that's what the first half of this comment from Rashi is trying to explain, that she admits that even if she had kids, that if she did have kids, that they could technically marry them because they are not bound by the prohibition of Jewish law, which says that you are not allowed to marry your brother's wife, even if your brother is dead. So in Judaism, it's very clear you don't get to marry your brother's wife, except for one point, which is if your brother dies having not had any children, then there is the levirate process, what's known as yibum, for helping to establish his name again and allow his name to live on. But that again is not going to be required in this case because one, no brothers were alive at the time that they died, and a brother born after the time of the death of the earlier brother doesn't trigger the levirate process. And two, as I mentioned before, they weren't legally married on the eyes of Judaism, thus the other aspects of Jewish law don't kick into effect. Neither the requirement of levirate marriage nor the prohibition on marrying a brother. Okay, everybody follow all that? I hope. Let's just double down here on the bottom of this Rashi's comment from 12. Even if I could say I have yet hope, or even if my heart told me that I have hope to marry again and to bear sons, even if I were to have a husband tonight, and more than this, even if I were to conceive male offspring tonight, and even if I were to bear sons, or even if I had already borne sons, meaning that phrase, and even if I were to, could mean even if I did have sons, that in general, if there was a baby or a newborn, would you wait for them? As Rashi continues, would you wait for them? This is a question posed in wonder. Would you perhaps wait for them until they grow up? This expression is similar to those who hope is in Adonai his God. But would you shut yourselves in? Rashi continues to ask. an expression of og, of the of being bound and imprisoned, as in he made a confining circle and stood within it. Or others interpret this as an expression of igun, meaning to anchor, being unable to marry. But that cannot be, for if so, the nun would have been punctuated with dagesh, or it should have been spelled with two nuns, which is a different version. And Rashi is arguing grammar and spelling here, and I'm not going to get into that. For against me is directed the hand of Adonai. Rabbi Levi said, wherever it mentions the hand of Adonai, it refers to a plague of pestilence. And the classic example is, behold, the hand of Adonai is directed at your livestock, a very heavy pestilence. Okay, so just trying to give a little bit more of a pinpoint of exactly what had happened. So the issue of agunot, of women who are indeed chained in the modern world, who are anchored to husbands that refuse to divorce them, is a very powerful and important one. And here we can see that there is already a dislike of the idea that a woman would be trapped waiting for a child to grow up or waiting to marry a potential child. We see this same issue happen in the story of Judah and Tamar, where Tamar is waiting for the youngest to grow, and then when he does grow, he still is not brought to her to be her husband, and that creates a whole nother situation. Also, of course, in the family of Judah. So this basic idea is that Naomi is telling them, look, you can't wait around for another child. Now, I can almost hear you asking, because this is certainly something that I have asked myself when I was first studying the book of Ruth and learning more about Torah, is, does this actually fit the issue of Levirate marriage? Is that what we're talking about or not? Well, you may have noticed that back in verse 12, that long and complicated commentary from Rashi is trying to tell us that no, the theme of Levirate marriage is not an issue here. And the theme of Levirate marriage is not going to be an issue with Boaz. It often feels that way because we are used to really that only that style from Torah and from Judah and Tamar to have as a reason why a woman might marry another relative within the same family. But that is not technically what is happening here. The main issue that is going to be underlying the rest of the story, which I can tell by our clock already, we're not going to be able to complete together today, is that there is land that is from Elimelech that Naomi is going to have to sell in order to not be in dire poverty. And that sale should be picked up by the nearest relative, what is known as a redeemer. That when your fellow is in a dire strait and they need to sell their land, a relative should redeem it, which would basically allow them to continue to live on the land, to work it and be successful without it leaving the family, the family clan inheritance, at least until the next Jubilee. So that's the main idea that's going on throughout the whole second half of this book. And Levirate is actually going to be a special condition that Naomi is going to put in place that isn't technically Levirate at all. She is going to attach a writer that she will only allow someone to redeem the land if they are also willing to marry Ruth. And that is not a Torah command, that is a Naomi command, meaning that Naomi is the one who is obligating that upon the potentials who might want to redeem the land. And that, of course, is why Boaz will eventually become the one who redeems the land and marries Ruth, rather than our friend Ploni Almoni, who, again, is unwilling to redeem the land as a contrast to Boaz, because he is unwilling to associate with a Moabite in the form of Ruth. Again, I'm trying to throw that in advance because I know we're not going to get to chapter 4 together. And that's one of the more counterintuitive aspects of the book. And I want to make sure that I mention that before we ran out of time. Okay, so we got through 13. And now we need to get down to the famous connection between Ruth and Naomi. Back in the Torah, back in old habits from doing the Torah class at this time of day, back in the Tanakh, in the book. And she, meaning Naomi, said to her, meaning to Ruth, See, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her God. Return along with your sister-in-law. And again, the mentioning of her people, of her God, this is why this whole section is understood as being an explicit statement of conversion by Ruth, that she is not just hanging around Naomi to see what happens, but that she is willingly embracing Judaism. But Ruth said, do not urge me to desert you, to turn away from you. For wherever you go, I shall go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people are my people, and your God is my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I shall be buried. So may Adonai do to me, and even more, if anything but death separate me from you. And when she, Naomi, saw that she, Ruth, was determined to go with her, she refrained from further discussion with her, meaning she no longer tried to push her away. Okay, so how do we understand these statements? Because there is more to this than just, I love you, I love you, I love you. There is a lot of subtext, remembering always that the Tanakh wants us to think about why the words were chosen, why these phrases, why these sentences, why this and not alternatives. And the reader is meant to be active and probing, not a passive writer in the text. Okay, so back in verse 15, see, your sister-in-law has gone back. In this word, the accent is at the beginning. All right, now what word are we looking at? We're looking at the word shava. You have to remember that I can point on this. Right, shava, that's the word for returning. See, your sister-in-law has gone back. She has returned. Now, I'm going to do a little bit of grammar here just because I think it's important to realize that there are subtle differences that sometimes get lost in other translations. The accent is at the beginning, meaning on the first syllable, under the shin. Right, that's what we know that is explicitly there because we can see the trope marker is pointing to the first syllable. So definitely the accent is there because it is in the past tense, shava. But, and in the morning she would return, which is another quote from Tanakh, the accent is at the end, on the last syllable, on the bait, right there, because it is in the present tense. And so it is in all similar cases. So sometimes the only difference between a present tense word and a past tense verb can be where the accent is. Shava, shava. Shava is the past tense. Shava is a present tense. Here we have a past tense word, and thus we have a past tense, or past tense accent. Thus we have a past tense word. And that subtlety is often lost depending upon different translations. So not something that, I don't try to do too much of the grammar, but I do want to point out things every now and then. All right, so now here is Ruth's famous retort to Naomi. This is something I have gone over in more detail in my conversion discussion in my nutshell, not my nutshell, excuse me, my Pathway to Judaism class, so you can always go and check that out if you like. Do not urge me. There's this word, tifki, what it actually is being said here, do not press me, meaning you are pushing too hard. For wherever I go, I shall go. All right, the beginning of the speech, and now we're going to unpack it. From here, our rabbis of blessed memory derived that if a prospective proselyte comes to convert, we inform him of some of the punishments for violating the commandments, so that if he decides to renege from his intention to convert, he can renege. So if he wants to say, you know what, on second thought, now that you've explained some of it, no, I don't want to be Jewish. And that's okay in Judaism. And as I say that to all of my students who come to convert, I tell them at any point in the process, up to the very last moment, you can always decide this is not what you want to do. Or out of the words of Rut, you can learn what Naomi said to her, meaning we can see that Naomi is actually teaching by looking at the responses that Ruth has included in her speech. So what do we infer Naomi must have said for us to understand what Ruth's response is saying? Well, Naomi said, we may not venture outside the boundary, the tehum of 2,000 cubits beyond city limits on Shabbos. You can watch my class in Mishnah on Eruvin for this, meaning that that's a rule for how we keep Shabbat. So Ruth replied to her, wherever you go, I shall go, right? This isn't just, I'm going to follow you. This is, if you tell me this is the limit on Shabbat, I will obey that limit. Naomi then said, we are prohibited to allow a woman to be excluded with a man who is not her husband. Right? Great way to create adultery. And she then, Ruth responded, where you lodge, I will lodge. So wherever you are going to live, then I will live there as well. So if it's fit for you to live somewhere, then I will live there. If it's not fit for you to dwell there, to lodge there, to sleep there, then I won't either. Our nation is separated from the other nations by 613 commandments. And Ruth replied, your people are my people. Yes, and I accept those commandments because that is what it means to be Jewish. Then I will accept those commandments and be Jewish with you. Idolatry is forbidden to us, which Ruth replied with, your God is my God, meaning, fine, I reject all idolatry and other gods. Naomi then said, 4 types of death penalties were delegated to the Beit Din, for the court, to punish transgressors. And Ruth replied, where you die, I will die, meaning, okay, if there are certain death penalty, capital punishment cases, and I transgress them, then I accept that that is a fair punishment, and I will be executed under those circumstances. And 2 burial plots were delegated to the Beit Din to bury those executed, 1 for those stoned and those burned, and 1 for those decapitated and strangled, the different degrees of severity of crime. And Ruth replied, and there I shall be buried. And I even accept that I may be buried in a different grave, depending upon a crime that I may have committed. Oops, and I went too far there. And then Ruth finishes off, and so may Adonai do to me, this form of a half vow, meaning that it's much of it is left implied, as he has begun to afflict me, for his hand has gone forth against me to kill my husband and to cause me to lose my possessions. So Ruth is also reminding Naomi that Naomi's not the only one suffering here. Ruth has lost her husband. She has lost her wealth as well. And she is willing to understand that that is something that is coming from Adonai. And even more, if anything but death separates me from you, but she is willing to go on record and say, I am willing to commit to Judaism and to you to such an extent that even if worse were to happen to me for violating such a commitment, I will still gladly make that commitment now. Meaning I know that I'm setting myself up for a potential worse situation if I renege and break my vows that I'm making now, but I am willing to do so. Even now knowing how bad things can be, even if they got worse, I am willing to go ahead and make that commitment now. And when she saw that she was she refrained from further discussions with her, when Naomi saw that Ruth was not going to be dissuaded, from here they derived, we neither overburden him, meaning a prospective convert, nor are we meticulous with him. Something that is often misunderstood. Many people are very confused about what it means to convert to Judaism, and many people who are Jewish make it very confusing because they don't understand either. But the rabbis in the Talmud and throughout Jewish law are very clear that when somebody comes to convert, we explain the basics of what it is to be Jewish. We explain the different types of commandments and the different punishments that go with them for failing to fulfill them or for transgressing them. But we do not expect somebody who is converting to actually know every single commandment and to be perfect in carrying out every single commandment. Yes, don't murder, things like that. Obviously, we're expecting that to be complied with, but we are not going to create an onerous burden. Indeed, in the ancient world, it would be much like a conversation of this. And as we see from the example that Rashi gives of the conversation between Ruth and Naomi, we can get an example of some of the types of topics that would be discussed, and quite in modern terms, superficially. And yet the overall issue was the commitment of the person who wanted to convert. If they understood the basic structure of Judaism, we've got a bunch of commandments. Some of them we have to do, some of them we are prohibited from doing. And there are, very real consequences to what we do. And you give a few examples, and the person is still willing to say, yes, I accept everything that you are telling me, and I will follow the commandments to the best of my ability as I learn them. In the old days, a person could be converted immediately at that point. Nowadays, I will admit, we still give more time than perhaps is strictly necessary to make sure that a person truly understands. It's one of the luxuries of the modern world to have a little more time to do some things. But really, speaking for what we see here in Tanakh, as well as in rabbinic literature, a conversion can be a very quick process under those circumstances. Okay, moving on to make sure that we can at least finish one chapter. So the two of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. And on their arrival in Bethlehem, the whole city was astir on their account. And the woman remarked, "Is this really Naomi?" She said to them, "Do not call me Naomi," which is basically meaning sweet and pleasant, like Naim, but call me Mara, from embittered one, from the word mar, for most bitterly has God dealt with me. I have gone forth full, but Adonai has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when Adonai has testified against me and the Almighty has brought catastrophe upon me? Thus did Naomi return, and Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, with her. They had returned from the fields of Moab, and they arrived in Bethlehem at the start of the barley harvest. Okay. Not too many comments on Rashi for this, but let's get them on the board. So the two of them went on, now that they've agreed, and Rabbi Abahu said, "Come and see how dear the proselytes are before the Holy One, blessed is he." As soon as she decided to convert, Scripture compared her to Naomi by stating the two of them, Shtehem. Right? It is no longer Naomi and Ruth, or Naomi and her daughter-in-law. It is now Shtehem, the two of them. They have become like one. They have become equals. They have become Jewish equally together. The whole city was astir. The whole city became astir. They had all gathered to bury the wife of Boaz, who had died that very day. So this is answering two questions. One, what do we mean the city was astir? Was it like just everybody came out when they heard Naomi was walking in? Or was there some other reason why the city was already active? And that's, as we'll see, why the news spread so quickly. And the second question is, wait, is Boaz single? Because Boaz is going to eventually get married to Ruth. And, it feels a little weird. Was he just taking a second wife? Or was he actually single? And it would seem odd that a man of his standing, of his apparent age, would be single. And so one explanation that covers both issues would be that there had been a funeral, that Boaz had just buried his wife, and thus he is single. And because he was so respected by the community, they were all there to support him during the burial and to comfort him. And that's why they were all available to then notice that, hey, wait, Naomi's back. And of course, she is connected to his family. And thus we get in the, this is really Naomi. Here we just want to make sure that we understand this is a chataf interrogative. Hazot, right? Is this Naomi? That it's not, here is Naomi, but it's a question. And they are pointing out that they are shocked because she is coming back, with no wagons, with no mules, that she used to be so wealthy, and now she comes back with nothing. And that makes it hard to believe. And then, of course, her responses. I had gone forth full. What does it mean by I have gone forth full? Well, with wealth and with sons. That's what it was to be full in the ancient world for many women. Or another interpretation, she had gone forth full in a more literal sense, meaning that she had been pregnant. So with that idea, then Naomi would have lost three children. But he, meaning God, has testified against me. What does that mean? Well, he has testified against me that I had sinned before him. Now, we already saw earlier on that Naomi was exonerated because she was doing only what her husband had forced her to do. But that doesn't mean from Naomi's point of view that she does not feel some level of responsibility for what happened. Or another explanation is that the divine attribute of justice has humbled me, as in the pride of Israel shall be humbled. So there's another way to read this, not that she is guilty in front of God, not that she was testified against by God, but instead that God has humbled her. He's brought her down a notch. That indeed, perhaps Naomi is admitting that when she left with her husband, perhaps she was a more arrogant woman at that time. Perhaps she was not properly sympathetic to the needs of others, and perhaps she needed to learn a bit of humility. Unfortunately, she learned it in the harshest possible ways. And then verse 22 brings us to the end of chapter 1, that this is the start of the barley harvest. This is speaking about the harvest of the Omer, reminding us, and indeed all the people in Europe as well, that Rashi would have been talking to, that the barley harvest comes during the counting of the Omer. Indeed, the beginning of the Omer is the beginning of the barley harvest in the land of Israel. And that's part of what is celebrated during the time of Pesach. And here we see that that is going to be the immediate timeline for the rest of the story. Now, what does that tell us as well for our holiday of Shavuot? Well, it means that through the counting of the Omer, which is just coming to its conclusion, we are living through the same time period as the story of Ruth. And just as Ruth is going through this time period of connecting to the Jewish people and connecting to God through the gift of the commandments, as commandments play a very important role throughout the story, so too, we are about to celebrate the giving and hopefully receiving of the Torah through the holiday of Shavuot. So this is the most explicit reason of why we read the story of Ruth at the time of Shavuot, because it matches the timeline of the Omer, the barley harvest, and the story of Ruth. But there is, of course, a second reason of why we read it at the time of Shavuot, and that is because Shavuot is also the time of the wheat harvest. Now, what does the wheat harvest have to do with the barley harvest? Well, because the theme of harvesting is central throughout this entire text, harvest and famine, I should point out. And that means it is another time to remind us that as we prepare for the most important harvest, the wheat harvest, we have to be mindful of those that are in need. We have to be willing to allow the dropped sheaves to be gleaned by those who come behind that are trying to support themselves. We cannot begrudge them. We cannot shoo them away. We cannot mistreat them. Themes that are very front and center throughout the section of chapter 2. So the fact that this is read at the time when, if we were still living in Israel as farmers, we would all be just about ready to put sickle to the wheat, to begin to harvest it, to gather it in. And we get a strong, strong reminder of, look carefully at those people who need to come and glean after you. You need to look on them the same way that Boaz looked upon Ruth. You need to treat them with the same kindness, the same respect, because you don't know. There could be someone out there that is the grandfather, grandmother of King David, or in our more modern terms, of Mashiach. And they are waiting for the right miracle of human kindness to give them the opportunity to move forward in their life and not suffer. So it's not just a incredible historical lesson about other people coming and embracing Torah and about all of the miracles that happen through this confluence of events. It is also a very strong reminder of how we need to treat other people as well at our moment of peak self-interest, meaning when we're out harvesting literally for ourselves, we cannot only be doing so just for ourselves. And looking at my clock, we're going to go ahead and leave it there rather than beginning chapter 2. Of course, please continue on your own. As always, I am available for questions, phone, text, emails, whatever you like. And I hope everybody has a wonderful Chag, a wonderful festival. And I will finish off with a